folks. I think we're going to get started. Welcome to the quarterfinal round of the Hart Invitational. In this round today, on opening proposition, we have Vermont GL. On opening opposition, we have RMC RH. On closing proposition, we have Vermont AN. And on closing opposition, we have Carleton MC. I'd like to congratulate all the speakers for making it this far in this competition. Your judging panel today is going to be Steve, Sophie, Brian, Christine, and I'm Jason, and I'll be chairing. And so without any further ado, I'm going to call upon the Prime Minister to open the debate on the topic, something more about this House to create a constitutional role for the Pakistani military.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isaac and I tell you two things to begin with. One, that Pakistan exists in a region of the world which is likely to experience military problems for the next several decades. Why? Because they exist around unstable countries like Afghanistan. Because they exist in a border tension with a nation like India. All kinds of problems like these. Secondly, we tell you that at present, the Pakistani military is under-efficacious. What does this mean? It means things like they're misallocated. It means like they lack clear command structure. It means like there is lack of continuity between presidential decrees and military behavior. We seek to fix these two problems. And in doing so, stand on the principle that in times when specialized knowledge is required and is being underutilized, we ought to better utilize that specialized knowledge. So what is our policy? Our policy is that the Pakistani army will promote a series of top generals. This is sort of like the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And in the Constitution, the combined and unanimous vote of these generals can serve as a veto for military decrees from the President. That is the policy we are proposing. Now, what is the problem we see? Firstly, we see that Pakistan at present is a mess. They're dealing with a number of problems, right? They're dealing with a border skirmishes and dispute in Kashmir. They're dealing with enormous problems of terrorism and a refugee crisis on the border with Afghanistan. They have natural disaster issues. There's all kinds of things. Now, the natural disaster is a temporary issue. We think things like the border dispute with Kashmir and things like the terrorist problem in the border with Afghanistan are unlikely to go away. We think these are long-term problems for which they have been under-efficacious. They're especially unlikely to go away in as far as the military is under-efficacious. Now, what's the problem? We see two things. One, the government lacks clear control and support and cohesion between what the government says and what the military does. Secondly, we see that the government is tremendously influenced by interests like the United States and also sometimes, unfortunately, interests like money, and less focused on things like what in fact happens. So what sorts of things do we see as a result of this? We see things like 2/3 of the Pakistani active military being along the Kashmir border when they need more in the border with Afghanistan. We see troops lack clear command structure, which is why sometimes they're colluding with the Taliban and sometimes they're fighting them. We see, yeah, go for it.
Yes, but the Pakistani army is the force that's been requesting more and more presence along the Indian border and ignoring the Afghan border. Why would giving them veto over the presidential authority make that any different?
Okay, I'm going to get into this a little bit later, but it's going to require negotiation as opposed to this like parastatal operation that they've been conducting for the past like decade or so, right? So we're going to talk more about that. So what we basically have is we have inefficacy and mixed messaging. Now, how do we think that our model is going to solve these problems? Well, we think it's going to do two things. One, it's going to lead for better and more reasonable demands on the part of the government for the military. And second, we think it's going to create unity between, well, at least greater unity between government policy and military and actual military operations on the ground. So in terms of better commands, we think that the Zardari government and Pakistani government in general doesn't necessarily understand what the situation is or what the military is dealing with. Why? Why do we think this? Well, because we see the military like not having a clear command structure, like doing things that it wouldn't have the command to, and like also behaving in ways that are not in what the government would have wanted them to. So we think that what we'll do here is we'll allow for this voice to have an input. We think this is a lot like having the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States. Or on like a related issue, if there's like an economic issue we don't think the government's capable of handling, we have something like the Federal Reserve Board. So what we think the issue is, we think that like at present, the Pakistani government is heavily influenced by interests like the United States, interests from abroad, and also like domestic popularity. What they're under-influenced by is the actual military necessity in that country. So we think that what this will do is force the Pakistani government to be, at least in some sense, accountable to what people are looking for. No, thank you. Secondly, however, we think we're going to see unity in government policy and military operations. We think this is important. We think what's happening in the status quo is that the president is making promises to the international community, promises to the people, that sort of thing, that the military can't reasonably uphold or has no interest in upholding. Under our policy, they'll be forced to negotiate on this issue. Yes, sir, Matt.
Right, but you're giving them the power to veto it. Civilian interests are necessarily going to be subsided to military interests, which are completely different.
Okay, one, we don't see why they're completely different, right? Like, we think the military is, like, made up of civilians in many cases, right? And we think that they also, like, live in Pakistan. But secondly, like, so, like, if there's a big flood and no one's being helped, that's problematic for them, right? So we don't see why that's necessarily true. Secondly, we think we're gonna have, like, a system of negotiation, right? That's why you need, like, the combined vote. And we think that, like, it's very problematic for everybody if nothing gets done. So we think what's likely to happen is we'll have greater negotiation and more reasonable military policy. No, thank you. So, what do we think, like, the practical benefits of our plan are going to be? We think we're going to see greater efficacy against the Taliban. Why? Because the people making promises to the Western world that they're going to kill the Taliban, and the people who are actually being asked to kill the Taliban will have to talk about how that's going to happen now. We think in the status quo, that doesn't really happen necessarily, right? We think that there's, like, lack of clear command structure, there's lack of, like, what do you need being asked? There's, like, the president and the government making promises to the people, making promises to neighboring countries, making promises to the Western world, and the military that's just sort of being told, carry out those promises and operating as they see fit. We think under our policy, there will be greater discussion, right? We think that will be good. But secondly, we think this is better for, like, democracy in the long term, right? We think, for one, it reduces the risk of military coup. We think that's good. We think, like, if we involve someone in the government, they're less likely to kill them, right? Because they have a constitutional, and, like, takeover, because they have a constitutional, like, role in doing it. We think that's good. But furthermore, we think that we're likely to get, like, better policy, which means safer people and, like, you know, better situations in Pakistan. So, what did we bring to you today on our side? We told you, one, that Pakistan is in not a good situation, and that part of the reason is that the military is underefficacious, that the government and military aren't talking properly, and that there's not continuity in government policy and military behavior. We told you what our model is going to be. We told you about how we think that this will create two things. It will create better military operations and unity in government policy. We think that will be good. One, in terms of efficacy against the Taliban, and secondly, in terms of democracy. So, in as far as Pakistan is not likely to see an end to its problems in the near future, and in as far as the military is essential to mitigating those problems, we think we probably ought to consult them more than we are in the status quo. We propose. Thank you.
Thank the Prime Minister for his remarks, and I'd like to call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open the debate for opposition comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As an opposition, we'd like to lead off the side of the round by getting into a couple of really big problems that we see with this resolution. I'm going to talk to you first of all about how in no state should the military ever have the ability to dictate policy, which is essentially what's going to result from this resolution. Secondly, I'm going to talk about specifically in Pakistan why the military has already shown that it's probably not going to do a very good job of handling this responsibility. And then I'm going to get into the points brought up by the member opposite and explain why none of them are, like, they're mostly counterintuitive, and a lot of the examples they bring up actually lead to our side of the house taking their own today. So, Mr. Speaker, why should the military never have this sort of constitutional role in government? Well, the model the government has presented to us is that the military chiefs of staff, general's body, should be able to veto decisions that are being made in their respect. And what we think is going to come out of this, Mr. Speaker, what we think is the logical result of this, is if any decision is made on the military that the military doesn't like, for instance, if they're being told to stop spending money on things, if they're being told not to attack certain people, not to act against the population, they're not going to be willing to respond to this because they have the constitutional right to say, no, we don't think that's the way things should be done. And the reason this is a problem, Mr. Speaker, is that the military organization, because of the way it functions, has different views on dissent and debate and open discussion compared to the civilian population. In the military, if your higher-ups tell you to do something, you follow through, you don't question the reason for asking for it. This is not how a functional government operates, Mr. Speaker, because governments, when they need to look at the interests of the population, frequently the entire population does not share the same interests, and my colleague's going to talk about this more in his constructive material. But the military doesn't understand this, Mr. Speaker. They simply accept that the interests of the state, as decided by the highest levels, should be the interests of the population, and if the population thinks differently, they're wrong and dangerous dissenters. Now, the military also takes a view of threats as either something that is on their side and useful, or something that is an enemy and must be eliminated. the military does not accept negotiation as an acceptable way of solving problems because they have tanks and bombs. And in the case of Pakistan, nuclear weapons that they can use to resolve these issues. And they don't see any reason why they should be restrained from using them.
Does the military ever see the current government as a threat to themselves or the country?
Yes, the military can see the current government as a threat to itself, and this goes to my second point. But the military has every reason to see its current government as a threat to itself if the government is making decisions that are restricting the military from taking actions that it wants to take. We think it's very, very wrong to say that the military should not have to listen to the government if it's telling it things it doesn't want to hear. Specifically in Pakistan, the military's job is essentially to prepare against fights against India. This is exactly why this was brought up by my colleague, that the military guards it's along the border with India and that ignores Afghanistan because they don't see Afghanistan as a major threat to them in the same way as you see the Indian military. We think that the end result of this would be that because they have more control over policy, they would focus everything directly onto India, and that because that's what they view as what the state needs, not what the government views as what the state needs. I'd like to bring a couple examples historically of what happens in states that do enshrine constitutional roles for the military. The first one, more of a current example, is what's happening in the country formerly known as Burma, which is essentially run by the military, has a military that sees its own interests as supreme over the interests of the rest of its population. And it's fairly evident that that is not working out for the people who live there. Dissent is completely crushed. Elections are a complete sham. The foreign food aid is refused because the military doesn't want to lose prestige, regardless of whether it's the best option for the population. We think that's a problem with this.
Okay, there's a difference between an all-out military junta and like a veto power with regard to military decree, don't you think?
No, we don't think so. This is my second example. The last major country to do this was the Empire of Japan, which gave the military members of its cabinet veto power over the formation of a government. And it should be well known what happened to the Empire of Japan once they let the military run their government. They went on a conquest spree of Eastern Asia, got their country firebombed into the ground, because they considered that the military's interests of conquest were superior to the citizens' interests of not getting in a major war with all the countries around them. We think that fundamentally that is a military junta, is where the military has the ability to control the actions of the government. Even if the prime minister is nominated, or the prime minister and president are nominally at the top of the chain of command, if the military can stop them from taking any actions in regard to defense policy and in regard to war, the president is not in control, because all that he can do is sit there and get shut down until he gives in and gives the military what they want, which is the only way something will proceed past the veto. So we think that that is fundamentally unresolvable. Specifically to Pakistan, how has the Pakistani military demonstrated they can't handle this? Well, first of all, they've already, even though they don't have a constitutional role, they still interfere with the civilian government. We think that it's only going to encourage them to give them a role because it will let them justify these actions. Secondly, they've already committed coups against the government in the past. Again, we think these are easier to justify if they have a legislative basis for their actions. Getting into what's brought up by the government, first of all. Their first point is that Pakistan lives in a dangerous region, so it's okay to sacrifice democracy in order to let them protect themselves. But we think, first of all, the reason the Pakistani military doesn't do things very well isn't because the government's holding them back. It's because they want to do things the way the government says it's being done very well. They want to focus on India rather than on the north. The military doesn't really care about helping the civilians if an earthquake happens because that's completely irrelevant to their mission of defending Pakistan against foreign aggression. We don't see how this is going to help them in the case of the next earthquake. Secondly, they talk about how the government is influenced by the United States and money, and it would be better to let the military avoid that influence. Well, we think that it's wrong to let the military, which is influenced by Islamic fundamentalism, which is influenced by an opposition to democratic principles, and by a deep and undying hatred for their Indian neighbors. We think that they are definitely the wrong country, the wrong power to be having this, particularly when that would give them control over the use of nuclear weapons in an engagement against India, because they would be able to veto any decision not to use nuclear weapons. We think that's only going to lead to the deaths of millions in this case. Secondly, the point that the government doesn't understand the military, so the solution is to let the military do their own thing without oversight. We think a better solution is find a useful defense minister who knows his job and can actually do something, as opposed to make the defense minister useless, make the prime minister unable to control his own country. They also argue that we should be having, rather than unclear chain of command, no chain of command. That's, again, silly. And the final point that government's brought up is they've convinced themselves this is going to reduce the likelihood of a coup. All I have written down for rebuttal is a bunch of question marks because I really don't understand what the logic behind that point is. We think that giving the military more rope, more legitimacy as an actor, and given the strong incentives they have to act against democratic opposition and to act against a civilian government that tries to hold them back, is only going to encourage the Pakistani military to take a far more aggressive role in asserting its leadership over the country. My colleague's going to talk more about why the Pakistani military has different interests from the rest of the country in terms of ethnic makeup. But for the reasons that we've brought forward outside opposition, why militaries in general are incapable of helping a civilian government do its job, why specifically in Pakistan they don't do their job because they, in the past, have always demonstrated this tendency to focus on blowing up India and to focus on defending their own interests, accruing more money towards military projects. For all those reasons, we stand proud in opposition to this resolution.
Thank the Leader of the Opposition for his remarks. I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the debate for Vermont.
It's a little ironic that the Royal Military College of Canada wants to talk about how the military tends to make bad decisions and doesn't know what they want. We'd like to say that with the exception of this round, that the military often should be consulted, especially about issues where the military is concerned, because they probably know best. I'm going to delve into a bit of refutation about what we heard from the previous speaker, although we think a lot of it actually works for us. Then I'm going to get into my extension about preventing coups and that sort of conflict, because we think that this is incredibly important. We think they don't like coups, we don't like coups, but we think that we're better at preventing them than they are. Okay, so let's get into it, right? So one, he talked about this argument that, like, the military is now going to get what it wants. Yes, this is a good thing, right? So, like, let's take the example of India, for example. Like, maybe the Indian government is a big threat and probably will invade, for example, if you don't have 2/3 of your troops there. Maybe the Pakistani government doesn't care if the United States wins its war on terrorism in Afghanistan, for example. We think the military is capable of making this decision and is also capable of adjusting this decision. We think if the situation in Afghanistan gets too bad, they're fully capable of reallocating their resources as they see fit. Secondly, he talked about how the military decisions aren't necessarily in line with civilian decisions. That's why we're giving them the control over military parts of the thing, right? So we think that where civilians might be concerned, for example, about things like peace or getting along with your neighbors, we think that the military is able to look coldly at the situation and understand that there are foreign threats, for example, or understand when tough decisions need to be made. That's why we give them control over military areas and not over civilian areas of things like, for example, like, should we build this road or something like that, or have X domestic policies. Then I want to talk about this idea that, like, vetoes can't necessarily force actions. You can't, like, veto the idea that, like, we're not going to drop a bomb, because that's not, like, a policy that you make, right? You're very excited, but take a seat. Like, you can't, like, they never, like, the Pakistani government never is like, let's write a law that says we're not going to nuke India today. It's not how it works. There's nothing to veto there. We think what they can veto is if we say, maybe we will drop a nuclear bomb, or maybe we will go invade these people. We think the idea is to prevent the bad stuff that the military understands is bad or isn't necessarily okay with because they feel it's a threat to the nation and or the country. Finally, I want to talk about this idea of negotiation, right? And the negotiation will happen with these sorts of vetoes. The idea is that, like, if you say, I'm going to veto this, for example, they can say, well, okay, where can we compromise? Where can we meet you in the middle, as opposed to just vetoing everything you don't like, because then you just simply have a stalemate. I'll take the folks in the back.
Right, but what you can do is veto the removal of a military officer who doesn't listen to the civilian government.
Okay, but, like, the military doesn't necessarily, like, hate bad military, like, or love bad leaders in the military, right? So, like, I think that it's reasonable to say that if there's one person, you're very excited, but please take a seat. There's one person that, like, if there's one person in the military that's, like, acting out, for example, the military can understand that they too represent a threat to the nation and can say, we don't want them in there. And that's why we let them vote on this and we don't just concentrate the power on one individual. Okay, I want to talk about this idea of preventing coups, because I think coups are a problem that plague Pakistan, and I think the first opposition has made a lot of arguments that help us with this. So, we say that we care about stability, and we say that when we give the military a more powerful and clear role in government, it makes them more likely to make to respect the decisions that are made and respect the government that's in place. So we say that Pakistan has had a problem with instability and insubordination in the past. They've had a history of things like coups. They've had a history of, for example, military leaders not necessarily listening or respecting the wishes of the government. We say that this is problematic, right, for many reasons, and they kind of agree with us, right? So we think, one, it leads to a change in leaders, it leads to instability in this one. Two, the military can often stay in power, as we've seen in many other areas where there have been military coups. So if you look at places like Africa, what happens if the military doesn't feel like there's a certain amount of time where you can put in a new civilian government. But after that point, the military starts to realize how much they like the power, how much they want to stay there, and that's when you start to get situations like Burma, not necessarily in places where, like, yeah, so that's problematic. We say that, like, the more times you take this risk, the more likely it is that the military will stay in power. We seek to avoid this sort of thing by avoiding coups altogether, right? We say, moreover, they tend to do things like deprive civil liberties of people and shut stuff down. This is problematic as well, right? So we think that possibly also they can do stuff like put leaders in place that aren't as good. All of these things are problematic. All of these things aren't risks we want to take. We don't want to take the risk of the military taking power because of all the stuff that they've said as well about how the military shouldn't make decisions over civilian affairs. We like them making decisions only over military affairs, right? So look, we say that this problem of instability is actually reduced under our model, under our plan. To analyze this, let's look at why military do often perform coups, because this is interesting, right? So we say they do this when they feel threatened in several ways. One, when the military itself feels threatened. They feel like, for example, you're making decisions that are going to take money away from the military. This is where we see lots of coups in places like Africa. We secondly see that when they feel like the country itself is being threatened, they then tend to put the state above the leader because that's where their loyalty lies. And then you tend to get the coups like we've seen in Pakistan in the past, like we've seen in other areas, and that's when you tend to get the military deposing the leaders and coming into power. We say that this is much less likely to happen under our model because of the amount of consultation that we give to the military, right? We think that, like, when you give them this consultation, we give them this veto power, we think that in these circumstances, you are then likely to have them have decisions that they respect, that they have an input in, and that they don't feel are out of their control. You're so excited I have to take.
Okay, but say, for example, the government decides to spend lots of money on reconstruction, that's necessarily taking money away from the military budget, which immediately makes a decision affecting military affairs, which gives the army veto over.
But most members have like families that have been hurt by things like floods, right? We don't think that they're like crazy enough to hold this sort of thing up. We don't think like militaries often even like help in forms of reconstruction in other countries. We don't think that this is unreasonable, right? Like it's not like they're these like crazy hundred people, and we think that like if the country starts to go down the tubes, like obviously the military is going to feel affected by this as well, and like this is going to be problematic. So we give the military a voice, right? We prevent bad decisions the military doesn't like. If the military is very worried that the oncoming threat of India is going to invade, and they see the government not standing by and not doing anything, they're much more likely to depose the government. But if the military is able to veto these bad actions and say you're weakening our security position, and like they're able to like prevent these things from happening, then they don't need to do the coups. Then the negotiations can happen internally as opposed to completely removing the leaders. And this way we get rid of the risks. We secondly think that they're like they have more of a stake in these decisions because they feel as though these decisions have their input in them. They're more likely to respect them. So in the same way that if I like vote on a matter, for example, I'm more likely to think it's a good decision if it's been done. We think that the military, once they have the stake in it, once they've had these negotiations, are more likely to respect these decisions. So when they respect these decisions, when they feel like their voice is being listened to, when they feel like they're not being threatened and their country's not being threatened, then you're likely to avoid the coups that have plagued Pakistan in the past that are so problematic and so risky, and these are the things we need to avoid. So what have we told you? We told you that the military is good at making decisions for the military, where the military is concerned. When you take this away, when they understand that their voice is not being listened to, when they know that there's something right to be done that the government is preventing them from doing because of different loyalties, for example, that's when you tend to get these coups. We avoid that by giving them consultation, by giving them a voice. We think coups are problematic, so do they, therefore you should vote with us.
Okay, I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his remarks. Apologize on behalf of the noisy world outside whose environment I have the ability to speak for it. And I would call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close out the front of the debate on behalf of the Royal Military.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege and an honor to speak to the quarterfinals of Hart House, and I'd like to congratulate and thank all of the panel and the rest of the Hart House for running what has been a fantastic tournament so far. I'm going to give you one further piece of constructive material as to why the Army, especially in Pakistan, cannot be trusted to have any role in government, why would this be fundamentally bad for the stability of the Pakistani state. And then I'm going to engage in a lot of refutation and reconstruction, and I'm going to summarize front ops case with a couple of really big questions and sort of the ideas that fall in them. So the biggest point I want to discuss in this round is why the Army is specifically poorly designed to handle problems in Pakistan. Mr. Speaker, Pakistan is not a sort of unified nation. The only unifying factor historically has been Islam. But ethnically, this is an incredibly diverse population with multiple tribes, separation issues, oppression anxiety, all sorts of cross-border connections. Unfortunately, the Pakistani army is overwhelmingly dominated by the Punjabi tribe. Punjabis do not represent a majority in Indian politics, they don't represent a majority in Indian population, but what they do represent is a significant control of the state in like the most upper echelon of offices and most of the major officers. So what we see on side opposition is this has a couple big problems. First and foremost, that means the army's interests are frequently tied to ethnic interests, Punjabi ethnic interests. So while the member opposite says like, look, the military guys have families too, they're going to be interested in reconstruction, to a degree perhaps, but they're interested in focusing, if any of that reconstruction money, if any of that funding money, they're interested in reorienting it to Punjabi areas, to Punjabi population. What is the chief cause of the Balochi dissent movement? The reason that the entire province of Balochistan wishes to separate from Pakistan? It is because they feel that their cause is completely ignored by a government that is dominated by Punjab individuals. It's because they feel that a military made up of Punjab officers discriminates against them, enforces laws irregularly against them, tries to take away everything they have. We think enshrining an essentially Punjabi institution in the government of the Pakistani state, more so than any other Pakistani institution, will fundamentally aggravate this problem, will fundamentally make this situation worse. So what have we been hearing from side proposition? First, we hear from them that reconstruction will work because the Pakistani government has families. I think I identified the ethnic problem with this. The other big problem, of course, is that the people who are going to get the veto over government actions under Prop's model is not sort of like ordinary soldiers who have the problems with flooding and these sorts of things. It's going to be the highest ranking generals. These are the men who live in villas. These are the men who have houses in Switzerland. These are the men who have bank accounts numbering hundreds upon thousands of dollars. These are not men who worry about routine flooding and food shortages. These are men who live in the lap of luxury and worry about nothing at all.
Sir, then why do you want to put them in complete control through military?
Okay, have a seat. Because they might do it anyways, but in this way we have no legitimate way to oppose them. We don't support a coup. We think that the military should probably keep hands off government for all the reasons we're outlined. Their policy is like, look, if they're going to do it anyways, we might as well like give them half of the permission to do it so they can get most of what they want without a fight. We think it's a ridiculous idea and we think it's dangerous for democracy. Next, he said the military always makes good decisions. I mean, coming from a military school, which they had to point out, I know how ludicrous that is, but moreover, I think that insofar as it is true, the military makes the best possible decisions for the military. And I think we outlined on a POI why that's really problematic. For example, if you have a couple of $100 million that you could send building schools in the Northwest Frontier Province or buying F-16s to keep an eye on India, what is the military going to do? Which is better for stability within Pakistan? Probably the schools. Which is better for the Pakistani government in relation to its people? Probably the schools. Which is the military concerned about? It's concerned about what gets it more funding, budgetary problems, budgetary support, what gets it more autonomy of action, and what allows it to face what it views as the fundamental threat. So we think that essentially the military is going to be making decisions that are going to benefit the military, often at the expense of the state. And the members only point this to say, like, look, the military doesn't like bad leaders. They're going to get rid of lousy officers. But we think there's a difference between what a bad officer for the military is and a bad officer as far as the government is concerned. Because for the government, a bad officer is an officer who doesn't listen to the government. For the military, a bad officer is someone who's incompetent. So both parties like getting rid of incompetent officers. But the military has no problem with a really competent officer who has no interest in listening to the civilian government, because as far as they're concerned, that's an officer who's protecting their interests. So when the presidential decree says, please remove General such-and-such, head of the ISI, because they're funding the Taliban illicitly, and the military says, no thank you, because they're also doing it to provide us with strategic depth in Afghanistan in case the Indians ever cross the border, and the president says, no really, I insist you do it, it's a presidential decree. Under their model, the Pakistani army's response is, go suck it, government, we will do what we want. We will put people in power who are known for supporting Islamic fundamentalism, because we also see them as fundamentally supporting our interests insofar as we just really focus on the Indian problem. Next, he said, most of their border issues are long-term problems, so only the military has the strategic foresight to deal with them. First, I would point out that, as he noted, almost every foreign policy problem that the Pakistani state deals with is inherently military linked. What that means under their model is that the Pakistani military gains an effective veto over all Pakistani foreign policy. Recognize that means that any decision that the Pakistani military can legitimately say affects the state security of Pakistan, which by definition is any decision involving the foreign policy of Pakistan, is something now subject to the veto of the Pakistani army. Secondly, understand that the Pakistani army is responsible for a lot of these problems because their interest is not necessarily a stable, free, or even relatively liberal Pakistan. It's a Pakistan that continues to buy tanks and planes to fight India. The Pakistani army is the reason that tensions are so high with India, because they do patrol the border so intensely, because they do engage in violent border confrontations, seizing Indian territory in Kashmir under General Musharraf before he became the president very briefly. The reason that there is so much problem in Afghanistan is not because the army doesn't want to enforce the Pakistani, doesn't want to deal with problems, because it actively views what the government sees as a threat, Islamic fundamentalism, the new Pakistani Taliban movements like this. They see them as a valid paramilitary support option in the event of conflict with India. So there's a fundamental problem there. Next, he said that there's a problem with command structure. There's just some sort of fundamental disconnect. The civilians don't understand what's going on. I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, that the problem isn't that the army has a problem communicating its desires to the government. They've been pretty good at explaining what they want. The problem is, under this model, the army has no interest and no desire to do what the government says. Because why on earth would you ever do something that isn't in your interest when you have a constitutionally enshrined mandate to ignore something that you see as explicitly against your interest? They said, yes, we will have unity in government policy, That's probably true insofar as government policy will now be military policy, because again, as I point out, since foreign policy falls explicitly under the domain of military security, most of the domestic problems in Pakistan do as well. Long-term infrastructure investment takes money away from the military. Dealing with insurgents in the north and the south affects fundamentally the security state of the Pakistani state. Every significant decision taken in a relatively unstable nation like Pakistan is going to be affecting the military security of the state. This gives the Pakistani army effective veto, and when you have effective veto and all of the guns on the legal side of the state, you get to decide what happens. You say, I will continue vetoing your decision until you do what I want, and I'll probably coup you out on the way there. Instead, this will give us better attacks on the Taliban. The reason the Taliban is so powerful is because the army gives them weapons, because the army encourages their activities. They've only recently started acting against them, and the army's been doing it incompetently. Not because the Pakistani government's been giving the bad direction, but because they don't like the direction to do it in the first place. They don't want to be in the northwest provinces. They want to be in that Kashmir, staring over the Indian border, muttering threats and fingering the nuclear button. They said, look, the army never decides. You can't reverse veto threaten to do something. But here's how it works. The army says, there is a conflict with India. This is a security threat. We're activating the nuclear option. The government says no. The army says veto, and missiles start to fly. The army decides what it wants to do in a certain security context. It's up to civilian controls to restrict that behavior. You take away that, the behavior no longer functions. We proudly approach this.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader for his remarks. I'll call upon the Member of Government to continue the debate for Vermont.
Definitely seen some confusion on the side of opening opposition. They say things that the military is doing things like selling weapons to the Taliban. And we say that they don't really understand the nature of the way it works. What happens is that the ISI right now, the sort of specialized forces, are selling these sorts of weapons. But the military and the army itself are not actually involved in this. What we do agree with is that right now there's a disconnect. There's a certain set of interests that are not parallel with the government. And we think that we can change that by incorporating the military into the government. So that's going to be my extension today. How situations like this tend to work when the military and the government aren't really communicating to the extent that they could, and how this can create better policy overall. So let me first get into some refutation, because we have a lot of problems with opening opposition's case. First, they come up and they say that the military should never act on the government. And we say, well, we think that they probably should act on the government in situations where they know more about stuff than the government knows, right? So if they think that they think that, for example, drones falling in a particular region of the country isn't a great idea, then they're probably going to say that and then the government is like, oh no, it's awesome. We think that they might know that it's going to create more violence, and we think that they might be able to veto a particular thing, and we think that's great. Then they say, well, and then we say also the government doesn't always necessarily have the people's interests deep into their hearts as well. So they said the military doesn't always have people's interests. So we say, well, sometimes the government doesn't too, right? Because they have been doing things Al-Zardari has been making back alley deals about drones in particular regions that people in Pakistan don't love. And we say the government doesn't always feel that they should be doing everything that's awesome for citizens as well. Then they say, okay, the military is bad for this job because they don't always have the people's interests. And we say, first of all, the military focus on India reflects the people's focus on India, right? The people in Pakistan feel the threat of the existence of their nation is India, and the Taliban doesn't represent the threat of existence of their nation. Now, just because the United States would like the people of Pakistan to view the Taliban, for Pakistanis to view the Taliban as the #1 biggest threat, that doesn't mean that the people are going to, or the military either. Then, second of all, they fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the power that they've been granted, right? Again, this is a veto power. It's not a nuclear button power. Even if it were nuclear button power, the same reasons that the government's never going to nuke India apply to the military, which is they don't want to get blown up either, right? The military aren't this non-rational creatures that the first opposition makes them out to be. Now, then they say, well, there's going to be more coups because they're going to feel mentally justified because of legislation. And we say, not only, they say, no, now they can veto if they're pissed off, as opposed to shooting the government if they're pissed off. That was as its ascension. And then they so they say that the military, the military is going to be mean about the budget. We don't really think that's the biggest issue in this round. Then they say extension comes along, and he talks about Punjabi interests, and I'm like pretty sure that they're actually the majority in Pakistan. And minority rights are just as much of a concern in a democracy. Okay. If they're a minority, like, okay, they already have a certain amount of power. Like, you're not doing something that's like super, like going to like as I said, they're not going to go crazy. But also, like, just because they're a minority doesn't make them any less qualified at their job. They just, they're Punjabi. They like are only going to help Punjabi people. Like, please, they're the military, and we think that they have already been given this sort of position by the government. So the government already recognizes that they are like the most capable. So we think that they're probably going to do their job, whether they're a minority or not. Okay, now let me talk about my extension, which is about incorporating the military into the government and how this changes things. Because we think that this directly clashes with like the basic premises of opening opposition's case, which was that the military's like interests in the government are fundamentally different, they're not communicating, this is really bad, so let's just leave it be. Okay, we're gonna say, no, that's really bad, let's like do something about it. So we say, we're not just negatively preventing coups now, because, you know, as they said, they don't have to shoot the government, like they're mad, they can veto something, but we also think that we're positively creating change. What we're doing is we're saying that the military and the government will now, be incorporated into the government. And we've seen in the past, when the military becomes like a part of, like a political part of the situation, then they then are able to they're able to A, communicate better, and B, they're able to sort of enact change in a political way as opposed to like just doing what they want. So we say the problem in Pakistan is that there is a bit of a disjunct between the military and the government. So while the government is like making back alley and secretive deals with the United States to drop drones in particular regions, we say that first of all, we think that the military like doesn't necessarily support this. So we think that insofar as the military could reduce this if they actually thought that these drones were a really bad thing, and we think that there's a good chance that they would, then this is probably a good thing. So this clashes what they said about like foreign policy. Like now the military is going to have a role in foreign policy. Well, insofar as foreign policy affects the domestic policy, they might know something that's good about the foreign policy, and it might be better if there were fewer drones killing civilians in the regions of Pakistan that we're talking about. So we think that insofar as the government is making these secretive deals that the military doesn't necessarily appreciate, we think that the idea that the military could reduce this now is probably a really good thing. But we think the converse is true. It's not just the government, right? The military sometimes says like, yeah, we'll deal with a particular problem, but then for example the Taliban, but then they don't actually do it. But now we say they're going to have to openly veto a command that they don't let. And the reason that they do this is like very obvious, because they have the political agency to do so, and they are now able to like necessarily ensure that the command won't be carried out. So it's much better for them to like just veto as opposed to be like, we're probably not going to do it. So this creates a legitimate relationship between the government and the military. Now they're able to sort of openly say, this is what our interests are, this is what your interests are. And now we think, how can we make those interests particularly compatible? We think that that's what happens when you give people a veto power. Usually the veto power isn't actually used. What happens is there's a negotiation between the parties. That's often what happens, right? You say, look, if you do order this particular command, I'm going to veto. So the government says, what kind of command can we order so that you won't veto, right? So then there creates a situation where both parties are more pleased, and we think that that's great. So we say that political power is the best way to enfranchise the military into the government, and to make sure that the government and the military are negotiating, that they're communicating openly, and we think that that's essential for the power of any state in the future. So if Pakistan wants to become a really awesome and legitimate state that isn't plagued by all these troubles, we think they're going to need to know how to harness the power of the military in the future. This is going to be key to their development. So ultimately we say that this is a really essential power, this is going to help the problems in Pakistan, and we're proud to propose.
Thank you, Member Bevan, for remarks on welcome the member of the opposition to continue the debate for Carleton.
Hear, hear.
It's a magical phone, but it doesn't. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So here on side opposition, we're going to bring forward two extensions to this round. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about how in all countries, but especially in Pakistan, military policy is civil policy. Secondly, we're going to talk about peculiar issues to Pakistan and why it creates problems in the tribal regions when you establish having might as a substitute for political legitimacy. So firstly, let's talk about how military policy is civilian policy. Because side government has created this really artificial distinction that you can do all your military things uniquely and not have any effect on the government's ability to govern Pakistan. We think that's obviously false for a number of reasons. The first thing we would say is that Pakistan is a country at war with itself. You see a significant military engagement inside Pakistan itself against Pakistani citizens. At the point at which the military has the power to determine how they go about that, you affect the government's ability to, say, do actions in these regions, be it reconstruction or service providing, but also you affect the government's ability to come to considerations with these people, to negotiate with them, to actually incorporate them inside the government. We think that's a considerable problem. Let's talk about India, because we think that in many cases there's a significant civil motivation towards India that is completely different than the Pakistani military. Because we say that the average Pakistani has a number of issues, has a number of interests in a peaceful resolution of India. We think that trade is a big one. They are their neighbor. They are a giant economy. Obviously, there's benefits to the Pakistani civilian when you achieve a peaceful resolution. Secondly, we think that there's huge issues of, say, family reunification. People who have relatives on the other side of the border who they'd like to be able to see now and then. Right, so why does this clash with the military's interests? We think the military, first of all, has an incentive in creating conflict. We think that the prominence of the military in Pakistan is only increased when there is conflict with neighboring states. We think that's important. Secondly, we say that the nature of the Pakistani military, the way it was formed, the way its culture has been transmitted from one generation to the next, is oftentimes predicated on this conflict with India. So we think that that's reinforcing. The people at the top of the Pakistani military have been trained and ingrained this notion that India is the enemy. We think that's a significant problem. So what happens when you have these different views? We say that the Pakistani military then antagonizes India. We've seen shelling of Indian villages in Kashmir from the Pakistani government. You can't have negotiations with a government while you're simultaneously attacking their civilians. You therefore establish an absolute ability of the military to essentially veto any civilian engagement with the state of India. We think that's a significant problem. All right, so let's talk. I'll take you guys after I'm done this point. So we talked about the nature of a veto. We also say that the existence of a veto gives the Pakistani military a hugely disproportionate influence in civilian policies. Because at the point at which you can say, refuse to engage in all necessary military operations, unless they give you civil considerations, which are going to be targeted primarily to the Pashtuns that form their ethnic backbone of the military, that's a problem in terms of civilian policy. I'll take you.
Okay, in as far as our policy guarantees the Pakistani military a reasonable level of prominence, they're no longer incentivized to create conflict.
No, they aren't, because the nature of the Pakistani military, the sort of myths that pervade the military, all of which are designed and almost ensure conflict with the state of India. And secondly, we think that in sort of political prominence, in sort of just how much respect is paid to the Pakistani military, that's dependent on there being a significant need for the Pakistani military, which is only heightened by conflict with the state of India. So let's move on to our second point. We would point out that the Pakistani military is not the only military organization within Pakistan. We'd say there's significant tribal warlords within Pakistan. What is the problem when you tell the Pakistani military that the fact that you have the guns is approximate to your legitimacy in making decisions? We think it becomes impossible to tell these warlords or their followers that your political will is important. It becomes impossible to engage with these people because you're telling them that the warlord's power is legitimate based on the presence of might. Sure. We think that's a considerable problem. All right, so now I'm going to deal with essentially all the problems that have come forward from side government. The first thing they talk about is that Pakistan exists in a world that is problematic and there's a significant need for the military. First of all, we'd say that much of that need comes from the Pakistani military itself, which prolongs conflicts with states like India. Secondly, we don't believe that civilian control of the military means an abolishment of the military. We'd say that a civilian government also has an incentive to talk to the Pakistani military. I point to every other state in the world as an example of a civilian government that probably has a democratic incentive in pursuing the best policy. If you don't believe Obama talks to the chief of staffs and values their opinions, then you're insane. Like they can have a role within determining policy. What you don't want to give them is a role such that military interests completely outweigh civilian interests. Civilians are capable of balancing those, but the military has no incentive to pay attention to civilian policy. All right, they talk about promises to people. I've largely dealt with this. That a democratically elected government has an incentive to complete the promises they made to their people, lest they not be elected. If that means talking to the military, then that's exactly what they're going to do. All right, they talk about the idea of a military coup. They say this is going to reduce the frequency of military coups. I think that in an absolute sense, yes, it will reduce the military coup. But we say that the problem with a military coup isn't necessarily that a coup has occurred, but it's that the will of the people has been subverted by a group whose only legitimacy comes from their arms. At the point at which the Pakistani military is able to undertake unilaterally or demand actions on the civilian front, there's no potential. You already had this sort of coup. And it's worse because you don't have the corresponding loss of popular legitimacy within Pakistan and foreign legitimacy that comes from the removal of a democratic government. So you actually have a more pervasive number of coups, and you don't have any of the consequences that the Pakistani military might otherwise experience when they undertake a coup. So you're going to see it a lot more often. So what if we told you on second opposition today? The first thing we've done is we've established that in Pakistan, military policy is civilian policy. You're essentially giving the control of the government to the military. The second thing we've talked about is how this affects democracy within Pakistan, specifically how it affects the very undemocratic regions that border Afghanistan, how it legitimizes the power of the warlords. And lastly, we dealt with all the practical harms that side government has proposed to us. We've essentially told you, you can still talk to the military, just don't give them a veto. We're proud to oppose.
I thank you, member of the opposition, and I'll call upon the governor with to include the proposition title of this debate for Vermont.
Alright, before I go on to summarize the debate, I just want to do a quick piece of reputation for the 2 points that came out of the member of the opposition, one of which was interesting, the other of which is hysterical. I'll hit the hysterical one first. This is the idea that tribal warlords will be influenced, we'll see the government doing this, and be influenced to think that power, comes out of guns. They're not impressionable teenagers. These warlords, they're not eagerly listening to government messages and deciding what they're going to do based on that. They're going to do whatever they're going to do because, they can sell drugs and make loads of money, but not, because they particularly have, think that the government has signaled that this is a philosophical justification for their actions. Now, that was quite interesting. That military policy is civil policy, which is kind of a historical tagging of it. But this was an interesting point, right? Alright, the military will stop all sort of civilian policy that has to do with being nice to India. First of all, there's no reason, well, first of all, insofar as it's a diplomatic action, they don't have the ability to veto it, right? The model clearly only applied to specifically military issues. Sorry.
Yes, but at the point at which you're shelling India the same way that you're trying to negotiate them, can you see how that might undermine those negotiations?
Yeah, that would probably be a bad thing. Insofar as they can shell things, but insofar as they can shell things, then they're going to shell things now, right? All we're doing is giving them a veto power. You can't, veto, the state saying we're not going to bomb something today. You can, this doesn't authorize the military to take more actions. It just authorizes them to say no to certain actions. So we don't understand, and secondly, we don't understand why the military would do this. He says, they want more power and prominence by having more war with India. We don't know what that really means, right? What does it mean to have more power as a military? Does it mean that, people think you're more swell? Do people think you're more important? What does it mean if you're a part of a state that, that fights more often?
We think that what really, if it is a question of esteem, then we think that what will cause that to happen is people not having, say, unnecessary wars and not seeing their military leaders as bloodthirsty mongrels. So if they really are concerned with this idea of power and image and prestige, that's how they're likely to conduct their actions, with an aim towards protecting the country and serving its interests rather than blowing up India. So, let's go to the 3 questions that summarize this debate. The first is, what kind of decisions is a military likely to make? So we've got 2 very different scenarios coming on the different sides of this table. The second thing is, what is best for Pakistani defense? And then the third question is, what causes the military to act peacefully or non-peacefully? So, let's go to the first question, which is, what kinds of decisions is a military likely to make? Now, we want to point out and reiterate that we've got no refutation on this, that they're not likely to actually ever use this veto more than once or twice. Much in the same way that the ability of a prime minister to say, dissolve parliament, doesn't often happen. Why? Because rather than using the veto button every time, if you say, hi, I will veto this, then you have a discussion that occurs over a period of time so that you don't actually have to end up vetoing things. You don't get sort of gridlock, you don't get it's not like it's going to be a surprise that the military vetoes something. They're not going to not tell you that they're planning to veto this. They're going to have a discussion. So they become incorporated into the discussion. So, what sort of decisions are they likely to make? Now, they tell you, well, they're likely to do nothing. They're likely to want to do nothing but protect their interests. We think this is wrong for a number of reasons. One is that this is the idea that they would never want to go to war because it wasn't in their interest to do so, right? They would just want to be safe all the time. They don't want to get shot at. Is that the kind of decision that a military is really likely to make? No. But we also don't say it's not the other way either, where they're likely to want to go to war 24/7. We think they have a balance of interests that occurs. So, for instance, the way the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in the United States, doesn't just want war all the time or none of the time. They have a balance of interests because, even if it were true that they never wanted to send their soldiers into a dangerous place, then generals would never send their soldiers into a dangerous place, and yet they do, because they understand that they have a duty to serve. People don't go into the military because of particularly high pay. They go into the military because of a sense of well-being of their country, they have a sense of duty to their country, they have a sense of patriotism, and they have a sense of nationalism. We'd say, for instance, this is the way that the Turkish military tends to operate. They are very interested in having a secular Turkey. They're very proud of their country, and they very often, because they are constitutionally part of this process, have a very strong voice in maintaining that the country is on the right path. We think that the Pakistani military is likely to act in the same way. Finally, they're oh, okay, well, they'll represent their interests and their interests alone. Well, this isn't necessarily a terrible thing, right? If they have an interest in, say, not going to something that they perceive as useless and counter to their mission, then they probably shouldn't do that, right? Insofar as right now their only way to represent their interest is non-compliance, this means that you get a really major problem, which brings us to the second question, what this does for Pakistani defense. We'd say that the current situation isn't working. That right now you have the military leaders simply aren't complying with orders because those orders don't make sense. Or because they're really frustrated because the government is, say, making backroom deals to allow in drones. Doesn't tell the military about it. And then Pakistani soldiers get blown up by American bombs that their political leader said could come and drop there. We think that this sort of disconnect is why the Taliban is winning the war in the Swat Valley. We think that is at the point at which they're close to 50 miles away from Islamabad, from the nuclear reactor in Islamabad, when they made a big push a few months ago, we think that the Taliban is a really, really big problem and something that isn't being fixed. Why will this fix this? Because by being able to incorporate them into the political discussion, they'll be able to leverage their expertise, they'll be able to not simply be non-compliant, and it'll force the government to incorporate them into discussions, which will lead to greater military efficacy. Their answer to this was, oh, well, they just care about India. Why? They were just insistent. We don't think the military, certainly some military leaders are probably still concerned with fighting the Reds, in the United States, for instance. But, military leaders, have an aim to success. That's how the hierarchy works. That's what they get rewarded for. So the last question is, what causes the military to act peacefully or non-peacefully? Now, they seem to think that the military just wants to shoot everyone all the time. We say that they only shoot everyone in the country. They only have a coup when two things happen. When they're not feel like they're not being listened to and they don't have any other avenue, much in the same way that like when the IRA wasn't politically incorporated, they only used bonds. Or when they feel that their interests aren't being represented. And we feel like if they can use a veto instead of simply not being listened to, or instead of having to go for a coup, they're going to use that option, and coups are very bad. So for all of these reasons, I'm very proud to propose this motion application.
Thank you, Governor, for this remarks, and I'll call for the opposition to conclude this debate for close.
Here, here.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We've seen something really amusing happen as we move down proposition benches. This is the idea that with each speech, it seemed like the resolution was less and less important. At the beginning, they were saying, look, we'll use it as a great tool to communicate. And by the end, they were saying they may use it once, but it won't actually do anything important. So I think this is like an interesting and bizarre idea we've seen on proposition that minimizes its own importance. What we've told you on second opposition is the ways in which a veto power ultimately gives you complete control over a country's civil policy. Because the way we look at this is, if the government is no longer able to remove rogue leaders in the military, unable to remove and change the military structure, which allows people to do things like, well, let's say, sponsor the terrorist bombings in Mumbai in 2008, or fund the Taliban in Afghanistan. We think when these sort of instances take place, we think necessarily that when you can't change the command structure of the army, and when they can essentially cause the shutdown of the entire country by removing military operations, we think at this point you essentially hold the government hostage. So I'm going to talk about this round in three main questions, and it'll deal very neatly in refutation with the two things we've seen in the proposition. The first one is, how does this affect the national psyche of Pakistan? This will be directly related to our partner's extension. The second thing is, are the goals of the Pakistani army consistent with the government's? This will deal with the mythology of the dovish Pakistani military that we talked about from second proposition. And the third thing I'm going to talk about is, can military policy ever really be separated from civil policy in the way that has been described in the proposition? So let's talk about the national psyche of Pakistan. Thank you. We heard the whip speaker say, philosophy is a joke, and no one takes it very seriously. And national psyches are never affected to change things in military policy. Okay, no, thank you. Okay, so let's talk about how actually, like, what the roots of the conflict are with the Pakistani military and India and the roots in Afghanistan. Okay, these are ethno-religious alliances between Pashtun, Allied, and Punjab Pakistanis that necessarily has like a separation of power between military and government. So we see, how is this national psyche going to be changed? My partner told you, look, when you give warlords ultimately the idea that the army, that the might of the country is ultimately what's controlling it, and ultimately can hold it hostage, thank you, and can make these sort of crucial decisions, and can do things like ultimately undermine peace talks by giving terrorist attacks in India during a time when peace talks would be necessary. We see at this point the idea in young Pakistanis, and in perhaps disenfranchised Pashtun youth in Pakistan, that the idea that, look, these people have the power in the country, and the idea that this military ideals and these military objectives are what's actually running the country. This changes the national psyche because it entrenches it in constant warfare, and it entrenches the idea, and like a constant veto of peace talks, the idea that at this point, military power and military engagement with India and military support in Afghanistan are what's ultimately going to run this country, and we have a huge problem with that national psyche being associated with the government's backing.
Okay, if a military wants to hold their own country hostage, why don't they do that right now in the status quo with all of their texts?
Because that's called a coup, and that's actually the first proposition wanted to constitutionally enshrine. So let's talk about the first proposition right now. Team, prevent coups by constitutionally enshrining. Let's deal with my second question, are the goals of the Pakistani army consistent? What they told you on first proposition, and we saw it echoed in the extension speaker from second proposition, is the idea like, look, Pakistani army they want peace as much as anybody else, right? Like, realistically speaking, they just want their family and friends to be safe and happy, and they want Kashmir to be peacefully resolved. This is just such unbelievable horseshit. What the Pakistani army has proved time and time again is they're willing to undermine peace talks, they're willing to undermine any sense of continuing peace with India or continuing peace in Afghanistan, simply because they have ethno-religious, cultural roots for their conflict in India and within Afghanistan. And they've told you, no, look, realistically the only way to look swell in the eyes of the people is to make peace. But there's another way to look swell in the eyes of people, and this is to control governmental power, to control the arms and objectives of governmental power, and ultimately to be able to crush what you set up yourself as the enemy. If you set up a national psyche of us versus them, of a religious enemy that we must fight, and then satisfy that goal, that's how you become powerful in the eyes of the nation. And this is ultimately the extreme and positive goal of the Pakistani army. We think when this is the goal, versus what like the government wants to do, which is, let's say, organize a peace settlement so the trade can continue between countries, so that there can be a lot less people dying. When you see these hideously disparate objectives, and when you see the massive power that side proposition pretended isn't going to take place at all, when we see a fairly serious problem here. One last time.
Okay, so if the military does in fact have slightly disparate objectives, well, how do you actually make that better?
Because you don't give them the power. Like, I think that was like pretty substantially what we've been saying on side-second opposition today. Because like what they're saying is, look, there may be a slight difference in objective. I think I've described pretty clearly how like funding terrorist attacks in India in a time of peace talks is like pretty seriously disparate problems. But like ultimately, even if you buy for a second what proposition tells you they're slightly disparate, we think the exclusive purview of foreign affairs should be under the governmental role. Because of all the reasons first opposition talked about, but more specifically for what we've given as an extension in second opposition, the idea of how a national psyche affects armies, and the idea of how ultimately it's completely intractable between military and civil rule. We think in this case, because the objectives and the joie de vivre in the army of destroying people around them, we think when you see these two hideously disparate objectives, ultimately we're going to have to say that the government's objectives are more the ones we'd like to see on second opposition, and will necessarily not give the power the preposition pretends is in this. No, sorry. The third thing I want to talk about is, can military policy ever actually be separated from civil policy? And this is related directly to my project's extension. Because the idea on side proposition is like, look, they'll just use this to communicate. It'll only be in military things. It's because they have expertise. I think are pretty adequately described in every other country on Earth, with the exception of like some crazy ones. Realistically speaking, you talk to your military leaders and you get military advice from them, but ultimately when you see that they're saying something like, look, we should really be funding terrorist attacks on hotels, or funding Afghanistan, or like removing all Americans from our at this point what you see is it becomes a civil policy. In Pakistan, foreign affairs is civil policy. They like eat, sleep, and breathe the idea of conflict with other countries, and the idea of potential safety in the future. We can't pretend that every decision in Pakistan isn't in some way influenced by what they see as existential threats from outside. So when you look at a country whose civil policy is so intricately linked with its military policy, and when the military objectives of a government and army are so disparate, and all of a sudden you're saying that the army has the exclusive control of being able to demand its own structure, demand its own goals, and be able to ultimately take an entire country hostage by not being able to perform the regular military operations that they do. We see in this case of Pakistan it's going to be extremely troubled, and Pakistan is going to have difficulty finding any sense of peace. Because the national psyche of the country has been changed, because constant warfare has suddenly been entrenched in an arm of government. We're not going to need to see a coup, Mr. Speaker, like First Proposition talked about, because there will already have been one. But without the loss of life, and without the unpopular problems that come with a coup. Everything First Proposition has given you is all the problems that we'd see in Pakistan from coups, things like Musharraf brought in, by removing all the positive roles we've seen in the last couple of years from Pakistan actually seeking peace. This would destroy any future of peace in Pakistan by changing its national psyche. We think that's a serious problem.
Well, I thank the opposition whip and indeed all speakers for their remarks, and I will call the round to a close.